So when is something cultish?
So, one, you hear the term cult, and I think, I think it's a good idea to make sure that we point out that's different from a cult, with an O in front.
I'm not so sure we have too many listeners that would have made that connection to begin with, but I agree. Yeah.
Because, well, I mean, I think I feel like there's some confusion to some degree. So I'll throw out both definitions as found on Wikipedia. But cult is a term which is what we're going to talk about this evening. But cult is a term sometimes considered pejorative for a relatively small group, which is typically led by a charismatic and self-appointed leader who excessively controls its members, requiring unwavering devotion to a set of beliefs and practices which are considered deviant, in parentheses, outside the norms of society. This term is also used for new religious movements or other social groups, which is defined by its unusual religious, spiritual, or philosophical beliefs and rituals, or its common interest in a particular personality, object, or goal. So that's getting pretty broad, getting to be a pretty broad definition.
Yeah, and I think I would just interject real quick and add a reminder that things like yoga have been looked at as being cultish depending on the way it's been presented as well. Just to keep it in context that it all depends on the emphasis on meanings that may or may not be present that tend to be what drive this kind of delineation forward. For example, yoga without any mystic component, a health and fitness trend. Yoga with a mystic component, potentially cult. Like it's a bit overly simplified, but that's kind of the idea that you could draw here as an example. And I know it's not the example we want to necessarily dive into, but it's just a reminder that in the United States, this has absolutely been a discussion and would be on the more mundane side of what you would consider a cult.
Yeah. So I want to throw out what we're not talking about, and that is the occult, which is spelled O. So the word cult that we're talking about, CULT, and what we're not talking about is spelled OCCULT, occult. The occult is going with the Wikipedia definition here, but the occult, in the broadest sense, is a category of esoteric supernatural beliefs and practices which generally falls outside the scope of organized religion and science, encompassing phenomena involving otherworldly agencies such as magic and mysticism and varied spells. It can also refer to supernatural ideas like extrasensory perception and parapsychology. Like, I think it's really tricky because, like, certain, standing on the outside as a non-believer, like, some of this stuff fits religion. It specifically says things that fall outside of organized religion. It's like, well, then if it was a much smaller version of, if it was much, it's funny where it's like, well, religion might be an occult, but not a cult.
Well,
just pointing out I guess it's not esoteric. It's there's super beliefs in the supernatural, but not esoteric.
To me, the funny thing is that any religion would have to, by definition, be a cult. A cult. CULT.
I mean, yeah.
And
the government in Iceland categorizes all religions just like that, right, as cults.
And it's the reason I find this fascinating in general is because we immediately have a negative connotation surrounding the idea of the word cult. If you back off of what we know of more modern cult movements, such as McVeigh and others that have been demonstrably mentally unstable or ill or just not completely there, or have leveraged something to manipulate others, like an intentional malice, I suppose is a good way to summarize it. If you take a step back and think about, I mentioned Apple and Microsoft from the get-go, because there's a phenomenal website and book and all talking about the cult of Mac, right? And the
Yeah.
persona and general behaviors and acceptance of a group of individuals who embraced and evangelized the Macintosh platform in the early days on through, I would say, the early portions of OS 10 as well. And there's a certain subcurrent of that there, but I don't want to turn it into a technological or timeline discussion at all. Let's just say that it is still somewhat present in certain circles, but is maybe a bit more diluted than it used to be.
There's just so many. There's just so many regular folks. You know,
Right.
not. You don't have. You know, at most you like the worst affiliation now. Most of the time is fanboys.
Right.
You know what we call fanboys.
And the main reason I use it as an example is because, by definition, the idea of a cult is not necessarily negative, even though it is most often associated with negative traits or negative connotations. But it's not necessarily a negative depending upon the goal of the organization or group.
I think that's fair to say. But I think like some cult leaders that in our lifetime that have, or just before our lifetime, that have really given, you know, sort of solidified in I think in society's mind that it's a negative, you know, it's a term that's applied negatively. It's like, you know, you've got Jim Jones and David Koresh. And I don't remember if the folks in Ruby Ridge were a part of a cult or not. But those are some folks that I can think of that were, I guess, the Heaven's Gate. I think that was maybe borderline a cult.
Oh, that was definitely a cult.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
no, I mean, sorry. It was definitely a cult, but borderline occult.
Yeah. Okay. I could see that differentiation. The big thing that I would say is that there's a reason stereotypes exist, and that is more often than not something that is a cult is negative for people in general. Scientology, for example, is the premier example, I would say, of something that is run very much like a cult, something that is intentionally secretive about certain things and very authoritative about how you are supposed to do things. Those are trademarks of some group or organization attempting to manipulate people for their benefit or for someone else's benefit, which would be the general negative association we have with a cult. Interestingly, and I will be the first to admit, every organized religion could be classified as a cult as well, because they are all designed in some fashion to either manipulate or alter behavior based on beliefs and how leadership guides followers to whatever next iteration or step or component of said prescribed faith would be. And that's, I think, part of what makes this topic in general so fascinating is that you could expand that to the point of, I kind of used Apple and Microsoft already, and Jiu-Jitsu has been one that I've mentioned before. You could absolutely ascribe cult-like status to practitioners of that particular martial art, or any martial art, depending on how the political delineations of different instructors and teachers and lineages and all go. There is such an array in general of activities that can fall into this general idea of what a cult would be, that I'm partially trying to show how absurd our interpretation and definition of a cult is, but also trying to intentionally show how if we blindly follow any one of these different things without thinking about the meaning and understanding behind it, it's no better than being in our negative connotations of what a cult would be.
Mm. So I was, you know, the the ones I mentioned before, Jim Jones and David Koresh, those were leaders, very, you know, those were leaders of cults, and they ended very, we know about them, and there's been, documentaries and movies made about them because they ended very tragically. The I think all of them, most if not all of the members of the cult that Jim Jones led committed suicide. Like, that's where the term "drinking the Kool-Aid" comes from. Oh no, the Heaven's Gate people did that too, but I think the Jim Jones's cult is where drinking the Kool-Aid came from. Because they knowingly drank poisoned Kool-Aid because that was supposed to be how they were to transition to their next evolution. Yeah. Heaven's Gate did a similar thing.
Yeah, I think the differentiator between the two is that the Heaven's Gate participants didn't necessarily know about it specifically. I think that was the differentiation, but I could be misremembering that too. I'm not going to. I am absolutely not going to say my memory is 100% at this point.
Dear listener, the whole internet is at your fingertips.
Yes, very much.
You can probably look this up on the device that you're listening with. And then there's, David, I don't remember what David Koresh's cult was called. I just remember David Koresh, and they were in Waco, and I remember someone making a joke about before it all went ablaze. But somebody said, there was a multi-day standoff with the United States government, and they said Waco was. Somebody made a joke about Waco being an acronym for "We Ain't Coming Out."
Yeah, the sad thing is I don't remember anything about Koresh and the ideologies. I only remember the law enforcement and general response from
me too.
Waco.
It's decades later when I found out that it's all very Christian based. And when I say Christian based, they just use the first of all,
well, it absolutely was. Like, don't sugarcoat it. It absolutely was. It was just an extremist view.
I just want to point out that, in most Christian religions that are, accepted in the mainstream, the pastor of your church is not privileged to have, sex with any woman he wants in the church. Like, that's not a thing. And that was a thing with David Koresh. They were not only were they, not only were these like extreme view. I mean, I think it makes any formal, recognized Protestant or most Protestant churches look like. I don't know where I'm going with that.
So
I feel like there's no way to.
I think what you're struggling with is it makes the Catholic Church look like saints.
Well, maybe not as recent, but this is tough. This is tough territory here, but.
I was giving you a nice transition because you could have said, except for the pedophilia. And
exactly.
We could have carried on.
Except for the pedophiles, yes. So I did, when I was a kid, I think I was 10-ish years old when that was going, when it was in the evening news, I remember watching, the clips from the news where, like, the compound, the ATF agents outside, blasting music and like the busy signal on a phone, and then all of a sudden the buildings that they're in is they're set on fire. But what I didn't know was that everything was based on, or they used the Bible as they had their own manipulation and skewing of what the Bible says, and maybe they found parts of the Bible like, well, we'll just pull this straight out and that works for us or whatever. But I mean, there was they were there were people in there. They were raping minors. I would say any time an adult has sex with a minor, it's probably rape. So even if the child is like, no, I'm okay with this, I'm pretty sure it's rape. But I just didn't realize it was Christian until much later in life.
I would say the law
Statutory rape,
by the way.
Yeah. I forgot we had a whole term called statutory rape.
So there's a reason that, in general, I referenced that any organized religion could also be considered a cult, is because religion is most often used as the basis for cult formation and how you drive adherence to some level of acceptance or acquiescence to the rules that you've set forth. Because if you think about it, you're not going to come to me as an individual and talk about a sovereign state within or a sovereign entity within the confines of the United States and gain much traction. I mean, sure, there are some people who could. And I'm not going to say it doesn't exist. But that basis for forming a willingness to adhere to practices or beliefs just doesn't exist when you're talking about, I'm going to go grab this land and be exempt from state and federal or local state and federal law. Because that's bullshit. Like, I could be stupid and I could follow you for those reasons, but then that's on me. What you're going to prey on is your ideological or religious beliefs and structures as a cult leader or as someone who would become a cult leader. You're going to create a group of people who follow you based on your proclaimed allegiances to specific beliefs. Here's the interesting way we can turn this into a more present-day discussion. Would you consider segments of the Republican Party to be a cult in following Donald Trump, regardless of his statements or actions or anything else? Like, just the adherence and loyalty to Trumpism and Trump himself is absolutely, in my mind, a demonstrable example of what it means to be a cult. And yet, it's not something we typically go to when we think of the definition of what a cult is, because we immediately tend to think of a religious-based following or group of people because of historical precedent.
See, I'm going to disagree with you slightly, and I can go into the whole topic was to go into why, because I really I found the line where I draw the difference between, like, man, this looks like a cult, but I'm not sure, or I have found the thing that just really I've drawn the you could have everything that it would take to be a cult. But there's like one thing that I think is necessary that some of them don't have, and I'll talk about my my narrow miss. I think my family dodged a bullet, and I have lots of questions for my mom about it. But I think the folks that are following Trump, they are ripe to be following a cult, to be pulled into a cult. And I think Donald Trump could start a cult if he so chose. I don't. The reason I don't think the reason I would not say that they're a cult and that they have cult-like tendencies is that the line I see with a cult is like, what takes a church? What does it go? Where do you go from being a church in the United States to being a cult in the United States? And this sort of like insular aspect of cults, where you go to most churches in the United States and They are welcoming. They teach you what they want to teach you. It might be almost exactly what what a cult might be teaching, but one of the key differences that I've noticed is that cults tend to not let you out. Like, hey, we have, you have to use our dentists and our, construction workers and all the services that we provide. And that's how they start amassing money. And you can't, if you go outside of like approved resources, you get in trouble. So like there's a lot of, I've recently learned this because my partner Becca grew up in a cult. Like they weren't allowed to go to the doctor, and they pulled out for various reasons. And but that, like she talked about a lot about like there was some kid that broke his arm, and the last day she ever saw him was that day when he broke his arm, because his parents took him to the doctor and then they never saw him again because he was out of the cult. And so, consequently, because of this, we watch a lot of documentaries about cults. And there was a recent one that came out about this cult in Tennessee, in Brentwood, Tennessee, called the Remnant. And like I'm watching this, and I'm like, they just sound like church people, like kind of extreme church people. But like I knew people like this. Like I grew up with people that went to churches like this, and the documentary is called "The Way Down: God, Greed, and the Cult of Gwen Shamblin," and it's on HBO Max. And I was just like, like I was having a hard time distinguishing how they were a cult. And then she's like, look how they can only, they can't go to the doctor, and they can only use, people within the church, like their lawyers, their plumbers, their electricians, whatever it was all in the church. And it's like these people were like, at the head of this cult was like pulling in all the money, because that's what it all came from. It was very insular. And so I really sort of came to that distinction when I was watching this other documentary this past weekend called Shiny Happy People, which is not to be confused. I mentioned not to be confused with the REM song "Shiny Happy People," which I'm pretty sure where it came from. But that was based on the Duggar family, if you remember them. Do you remember the Duggar family?
Vaguely. I actually had to follow the link and do a little bit of reading before it jogged my memory. So I do remember it, but I don't remember it well, is maybe a good way to put it.
Yeah. I remember it happening because my mom and sisters would talk about it, because they followed so the Duggar family, evangelical Christian family that followed. They ended up following the teachings of Bill Gothard, and but they had a show on TLC or the Discovery Channel. I don't know. It was one of those called. Eventually, it was called 19 and Counting, because Jim Bob and I don't even remember his wife's name. They had 19 children, and there was this whole belief that. Well, I'll say I grew up hearing these beliefs, and my family was like around some people that believe these things, and so I'm watching this documentary, and I was like, oh my God, I know, they're following the teaching of this man Bill Gothard, who had a organization called the Institute in Basic Life Principles, and it was basically shit he pulled out of the Bible to try to tell you, I have the answers for every part of life. Anything you want to know, I have the answer for you. And they had some extremist views. The difference here between where I would say they were not, they basically had every possible feature of a cult, except for they didn't have that insular aspect where you can't go out and, associate with anyone that you wanted. They're actually quite the opposite. Their whole goal was like, have as many children as possible, raise them in the Christian belief, and that's how we'll take over the nation with our Christian beliefs, is by just overpopulating it with Christians. Which, sad to say, I don't think anyone did the math on this, but it did have an effect. It did create some issues.
So I think this is an interesting point of distinction, because I don't think the lock-in is a required component of what makes a cult a cult. I mean, I certainly follow that that's the extreme version, and that's what we tend to identify with as a cult, especially when you think about previous examples that we've already mentioned and referenced. But I think taking it to the point of lock-in, or some level of attempted lock-in, misses the point of what it means to be a cult in general, which is an adherence to beliefs, or an adherence to an idea or principle or leader, regardless of the facts at hand. For example, let's just use Christianity as the perfect, whipping boy for this particular example. In the if you think about the Catholic Church, there's a lack of or outright disdain for birth control. But it technically doesn't stop you from seeking medical counsel and advice on methods to reduce how many times you're going to end up giving birth. We'll just put it that way. It does, depending on the church, it does say, no birth control measures. I'm a little fuzzy on how certain groups actually interpret it, but let's just use that as an example. It's still cultish from the standpoint of attempting to control the end user or end person's behavior and what they can or can't do. But there's no lock-in. There's no requirement to use Catholic doctors, for example.
Right.
It's just, we don't agree with birth control, and if you're a true Catholic, you're not going to use birth control. But you can still go talk to these doctors and find potential methods for mitigating unwanted pregnancy, as long as it's not taking birth control.
Yeah, I think I would expect that having used birth control, and let's make a distinction between like preventative birth control versus medical abortion, like, or even I expect that, and I could be wrong about this, and if we have any Catholic listeners that want to correct me, I would expect that a vasectomy would be considered a form of birth control that would not, at some point, not be sanctioned by the church.
I believe so. So for full disclosure, what I understand of Catholics in general would be that a condom would be a gray area, yes, and anything beyond a condom would be an absolute no.
Yeah, so I was going to say that it's like so let's say you did some, use that form of birth control. I think, I don't think the church is going to excommunicate you, but they are, that might be something that you have to confess. That was a sin that was committed and is worthy of confession.
That's fair. That could very well be still looked down upon.
Yeah, and so I think that you were accurate in saying this is a cultish part of that church. And this is where we're using cult in a very generous term, where we're not considering all religions cults, but where like in the case of some of these other, so like I'll use the remnant as a good example. I think that if you were to go outside of the approved service that you need, like extreme punishment would be brought upon you, to excommunication, that sort of thing. So, you get kicked out. And whereas, there are things that you can do in the Catholic Church for excommunication, but I feel like most things with a repentant heart and a proper confession and penance. Is that what they call it when you're
I believe so.
so confession,
yeah.
they give it. Yeah. You can be restored. You can be restored. Like, the whole point is, like, you do a wrong thing, there's almost always restoration. It's very,
Which in and of itself is kind of an idea of lock-in if you think about it. But still,
I mean, that's where you could say, I consider all religions cults, because this is yes, that is a form of lock-in. So it's like, what degree of lock-in are we talking about?
But even I would say let's not necessarily include that as a method of lock-in. Even thinking about other religions, so think about Islamic extremism, for example, it's not nearly the massive problem that the United States government would like you to believe it is, but it does exist. Like, it absolutely fuels a number of terrorist sects and beliefs in general. There's absolute lock-in there, and you can see it without a problem. The biggest thing, and the reason I mention it, the same kind of idea and lock-in exists in almost every iteration of religious belief. It's just not overt. And if you take a step back and you actually think about, as we're describing the Catholic Church and thinking about, confession and repentance and everything else as a form of lock-in, if you think about the traditional Protestant church and the idea of, I just need to be saved again, or I just need to have someone pray over me again, and I just need to talk about it again, that kind of thing. It's the same idea. It's the exact same principle. It's just in a different behavioral setting. Which is why we get back to my original question about, when is anything considered a cult? And I think where we differ isn't so much about the idea of lock-in as much as it is the idea of selfish intent versus group growth. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the different cults we've talked about, there's a singular leader or a singular couple of people who stand to benefit from the growth of their beliefs and organization structure, whatever words you want to use to categorize this thing. But it's very clear that there are a handful of people that stand to benefit from any path forward. And the difference between a cult and a non-cult would be that consecration, no pun intended, of power in one particular individual or a small group of people, as opposed to a desire to see a group of people move forward in a positive manner. It may be misguided. Like, we're not trying to ascribe whether or not it's a positive thing or a negative thing over the course of the lifetime of involvement in this organization. What we're looking at is just, is it a person or a couple of people driving this forward for self-interest? Or is it a group of people who legitimately believe this is a positive thing for those people and the people around them, and are trying to spread it across as many people as possible?
Yeah.
And that's a really big gray area.
Yeah, I was going to say, in certain, as you were talking, I was thinking, it's like this Institute of Basic Life Principle. Yeah, they fit they don't quite have the lock in like the remnant and some other cults, but they didn't have a small. It wasn't a small group. They were they were very much into outreach, but they did have. I wouldn't call them charismatic, but charismatic in the sense of people followed Bill Gothard. Like they really, you know, were devoted to his organization and his teachings. And I was gonna say, for me, this was like a very interesting documentary to watch because it was like kind of half about the Duggars and then half about Bill Gothard's organization, and they were intertwined. But I almost went to one of his seminars. The only reason I didn't go is because he had a basic seminar and an advanced seminar, and there was an advanced seminar that my friends were going to, and I really wanted to go mostly because for the social aspect of like hanging out with my friends, but I wasn't allowed to go because I had not attended the basic seminar.
Interesting. So,
Yeah,
I don't know.
honestly, at the time, even I was religious at the time, but even at the time, I really didn't give a fuck about his teachings. I wanted to hang out with people.
It's funny because one of the things that keeps coming to mind, it's so kind of fascinating about this, is as in the previous show, you harped on this idea of being a better human being or just being a decent human being. I can see that being the tagline for the formation of a cult as well.
Mm.
And that's what to me makes this such a fascinating thought experiment because it's not really the belief itself. You can make anything a cult if you want to. In general, it's how do you take this thing and try to generate a following around it, and you can either go immediately into cult status, or you can go immediately into this is a social movement kind of thing. I expect there's an in between, but I don't see it. And that's what makes it such a fascinating concept in general to explore, especially in the context of previous conversations that we've had.
Yeah, I think that if there is this desire to make the world around you a better place and help the people around you to live better lives, that's not a cult. Even if you have an incredibly devoted following, but as soon as like I think you really sort of really the whole thing about when it starts to benefit just a few people at the top, sort of that's really resonating with me.
And it's fascinating because you can have the same message in both directions, and it's all about intent. And it's so difficult to discern the difference between a positive message and positive intent as opposed to a positive message and selfish intent.
But I think when you have selfish intent, no matter how positive the wrapper around your message is, that negative and that negative and selfish intent, it the positivity may only be a thin veneer on the surface. So,
Well, I think where you end up seeing it is in the I wouldn't say even long run. The short term, you can be caught up in the message, but you see cracks by the time you get a short time in. So I don't know if I would describe it as even like mid time. These are such relative terms, right? So the very short sighted immediate future, you see the positive message, and you start to become involved, and you start to see cracks. That might be a couple of weeks in, it might be a couple of months in. Like that's where there's a very subjective relative time frame. But I think that's the easy way to judge the trajectory of this thing that you're involved with. if you wholeheartedly embrace the message and it seems great and you move forward and you never see cracks in the message, there's a pretty good chance there's positive intent and a general interest in the message going forward. I cannot think of any cult where you would be involved and see positive intent and really want to drive it forward, and there not be a red flag or a crack or something in that messaging within a relatively short time. And I think the big problem is that it's easy to miss if you're wholeheartedly invested in the initial thought or message. And that I think is the big differentiation between something that we consider a cult and something that we would consider not a cult.
Yeah, I think that's why Christianity is so susceptible to forming cults. I gave you a couple edit points because what you said was really good, but I wanted to say what I wanted to say, and I'll let you figure that out in post.
Yeah, and I have a lot of thoughts there, but I don't have a good statement there, and that's the problem. Because I agree wholeheartedly. Like in general, over the course of history, Christianity has produced the most bastardized versions of views I can think of in general. Whether that translates to a quote-unquote cult as opposed to just a really fucked up interpretation.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I have a difficult yes, no, maybe kind of answer, because I 100% agree and will absolutely argue it until I'm blue in the face that Christianity has been used in far too many occasions to move forward non-Christian agendas. And that can include cults, it can include non-cults, just Christianity as a whole has absolutely been used to further non-Christian beliefs, agendas, actions, behaviors, etc. Where do you draw the distinction between an adherence to Christian beliefs and a use of Christian beliefs? And that kind of dictates my answer to the question. Because it's the exact same thing with Islamic teachings and beliefs. Like if you're truly a Islamic practitioner, if you truly consider yourself Muslim, as opposed to an Islamic extremist, it's the exact same debate. It's just easier to look at if you're a non-Christian where the divide is. But if you're a Christian and you try to pick the same divide, you're immediately biased. And you can't find that line as easily as you could if you were a Muslim looking at Christians. For just to make it a fairly, equal example. I imagine it's the same for every organized religion. Your religion looks at the others, and you can see a very clear divide between this is reasonable and this is shit.
Mm-hmm.
But when you claim to be associated with this religion, it immediately muddies the water to a point where you can't see that divide like you could see it in other religions.
It's a really good distinction. We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.